In a quiet neighborhood of New Orleans, Louisiana, 11-year-old Devon Booth shot and killed two police officers who were restraining his father during a domestic disturbance call. Officers Joseph Smith and Charles Williams died at the scene, their bodies crumpling to the concrete driveway of the modest, single-story home, as neighbors watched in horror from behind hastily drawn curtains. The boy had emerged from the side door of the house, his father's legally registered 9mm Glock pistol gripped in both hands, and fired 7 shots in rapid succession, without warning or hesitation. 5 of those bullets found their targets with devastating accuracy, 3 striking Officer Smith in the neck and chest, and 2 hitting Officer Williams in the head, killing both men almost instantly in what would become one of the most shocking acts of violence against law enforcement in the city's troubled history. If you're finding this video informative, please hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Now, back to the devastating events that unfolded that summer day in New Orleans. The Booth home at 1423 Magnolia Street had not previously been flagged as a high-risk location by the New Orleans Police Department, despite 3 prior domestic disturbance calls in the 18 months leading up to the shooting. Neighbors would later tell investigators that they often heard shouting from the house, particularly on weekends when Robert Booth, Devon's father, tended to drink heavily after his shifts at the Port of New Orleans. Lisa Booth, Devon's mother, had threatened to leave multiple times but always returned, creating a cycle of tension and reconciliation that had become the backdrop of young Devon's formative years. The day of the shooting had begun with another argument, voices escalating until a concerned neighbor 2 doors down finally called 911, reporting what sounded like furniture breaking and a woman screaming for help. Officers Smith and Williams arrived at 3:42 p.m., parking their patrol car at the curb and approaching the front door with caution but not undue alarm. Body camera footage later recovered from both officers showed a relatively standard approach to what appeared to be a routine domestic call, with Officer Smith taking the lead as the more experienced officer. Lisa Booth answered the door with a visible bruise forming under her right eye, initially reluctant to let the officers inside, but eventually stepping back to allow them entry when they insisted on ensuring her safety. The footage showed Robert Booth sitting in an armchair in the living room, visibly intoxicated but not immediately aggressive, attempting to explain away his wife's injury as a fall in the bathroom, while Officer Williams separated Lisa to get her statement in the kitchen. The situation escalated when Officer Smith informed Robert that they would need to take him in for questioning based on his wife's statement that he had struck her multiple times that afternoon. Robert Booth became belligerent, rising suddenly from the chair and lunging at Officer Smith, who quickly sidestepped, and with Officer Williams rushing back to assist, managed to restrain the struggling man face down on the living room floor. What neither officer noticed in that critical moment was Devon Booth, who had been watching silently from the hallway, disappearing into his parents' bedroom where his father kept the pistol in the top drawer of his nightstand. The body camera footage captured the officers in the process of handcuffing Robert Booth when the first shot rang out, the camera view jerking violently as Officer Smith fell backward, already fatally wounded. The last image from Officer Williams's camera showed a small figure in the doorway, arms extended, before the recording abruptly ended with the second fatal shot. Within minutes of the shooting, the peaceful street was transformed into a chaotic crime scene as patrol cars and ambulances converged on the Booth home, their lights painting the shocked neighborhood in alternating red and blue. Robert Booth was found still handcuffed on the floor, covered in his would-be arresting officer's blood, and screaming incoherently at the first responders who entered. Lisa Booth had barricaded herself in the bathroom, having fled there at the first sound of gunfire, and would later describe hearing her son's footsteps in the hallway, followed by the unmistakable sound of the gun being retrieved from the drawer where she had begged her husband not to keep it. Devon Booth made no attempt to flee, standing motionless in the front yard with the weapon dangling from his hand when backup officers arrived, his expression described by first responders as eerily calm and disconnected from the horror around him. The child offered no resistance when officers cautiously approached him, securing the weapon and placing him in the back of a patrol car while the full magnitude of what had just occurred began to register with everyone at the scene. News of the shooting spread through the city like wildfire, with initial reports creating confusion, as many found it impossible to believe the shooter was a child so young. Local television stations broke into regular programming to report that 2 officers had been killed in the line of duty, but early broadcasts were careful about identifying the suspect, some referring only to a juvenile male being taken into custody. Social media, however, moved much faster than traditional news outlets, with neighbors posting videos of Devon being placed in the police car and speculating wildly about what could have driven a child to commit such an act. By nightfall, as the bodies of Officers Smith and Williams were transported from the scene under the solemn salute of their colleagues, the full horrifying truth had emerged. An 11-year-old boy had deliberately taken his father's gun and executed 2 police officers in cold blood. Officer Joseph Smith had devoted 15 years of his life to the New Orleans Police Department, beginning his career in the wake of Hurricane Katrina when the city needed dedicated officers more than ever. At 41 years old, he had risen to the rank of sergeant and was known throughout the department for his calm demeanor in tense situations and his mentorship of younger officers like his partner Charles Williams. Joseph lived in a modest home in Metairie with his wife Michelle and their 3 children, daughters Emma, 14, and Olivia, 12, and son Noah, 9. He coached his son's Little League team on weekends and volunteered at his daughter's school whenever shifts allowed. Friends and colleagues described him as the definition of a family man, someone who carried pictures of his children in his wallet and spoke of them constantly, proud of every small achievement and milestone in their lives. The cruel irony that Joseph Smith died at the hands of a child close in age to his own son would not be lost on those who eulogized him at his funeral, attended by over 1,000 uniformed officers from across Louisiana and neighboring states. Michelle Smith, speaking through tears at her husband's funeral service held at St. Louis Cathedral in the French Quarter, shared how Joseph had almost left police work after a close call during an armed robbery response in 2013. "He came home that night and just held our children for hours," she told the somber gathering, her voice breaking as she continued. "But the next morning, he put on his uniform again because he believed in what he was doing, protecting families like ours." Joseph had recently begun talking about retirement, planning to put in his 20 years and then pursue his dream of opening a fishing charter business on Lake Pontchartrain, where he had spent countless peaceful mornings before shifts. The ceremonial folding of the American flag that had draped his casket and its presentation to Michelle, who accepted it with dignity while surrounded by her children, became one of the enduring images of the tragedy, appearing on the front page of newspapers across the country. Officer Charles Williams represented the promising future of the New Orleans Police Department, cut tragically short, having joined the force just 2 years prior after graduating at the top of his academy class. At 26, the young officer had already distinguished himself by his commitment to community policing, volunteering for additional foot patrols in troubled neighborhoods, and organizing a basketball program for at-risk youth that met weekly at a community center in the 7th Ward. Charles had proposed to his fiancée, Breonna Taylor, just 1 month before his death, and the couple had been in the midst of planning their wedding for the following spring, with Joseph Smith set to serve as best man at the ceremony that would never take place. Breonna would later tell reporters that Charles had been drawn to law enforcement after his own brother was lost to gang violence, determined to be part of the solution in a city that had struggled with crime for generations. Charles Williams's parents, Marcus and Emily Williams, spoke at his memorial service about their son's lifelong desire to serve others, a quality that had manifested early when he organized a food drive at just 9 years old after learning some of his classmates didn't have enough to eat at home. Charles never saw a problem without thinking about how he could help solve it, his father said, standing stoically at the podium while his wife leaned on him for support. He believed in the fundamental goodness of people and in second chances. Emily Williams, clutching her son's police academy graduation photo to her chest, described how Charles had called her just hours before his death, excited about a community outreach event he was planning for the following month. He told me, "Mom, this job is everything I hoped it would be," she recounted, her voice barely audible through her grief. He died doing exactly what he was meant to do, protecting people who needed protection. The deaths of Officers Smith and Williams sent shockwaves through the tight-knit law enforcement community of New Orleans, a department that had weathered many storms, both literal and figurative, over the years. Fellow officers described a palpable sense of vulnerability in the wake of the shooting, particularly disturbed by the randomness of the attack and the age of the shooter. "We trained for all kinds of threats, but how do you prepare for a child with a gun?" questioned Officer Michael Martinez, who had been in the same academy class as Williams. The police department mandated counseling sessions for officers who had responded to the scene and those who had worked closely with Smith and Williams, recognizing the unique psychological toll of losing colleagues to such an unexpected source. Police Chief Anthony Harris acknowledged in a press conference that the department was grappling with a tragedy that defies easy understanding, and announced that all officers would undergo additional training on approaching homes where children might be present. The broader New Orleans community mourned alongside the police department, with memorials of flowers, candles, and handwritten notes appearing outside the 1st District station where both officers had been based. Local restaurants delivered meals to the station for days after the shooting, and a fund established for the families of the fallen officers raised over $500,000 in the first week alone. Schools across the city held moments of silence, and many students wrote letters of condolence to the officers' families, expressing gratitude for their service and sorrow for their loss. The city's mayor ordered flags lowered to half-staff for 10 days following the shooting, and the famous fountain in Louis Armstrong Park was lit in blue each night for a month in remembrance. New Orleans, a city familiar with tragedy but resilient in its response, wrapped its collective arms around the grieving families and colleagues of Joseph Smith and Charles Williams. The investigation moved swiftly under the direction of Detective Ryan Davis, a veteran homicide investigator who recognized immediately that this case would require extraordinary sensitivity, given the age of the suspect. The crime scene at 1423 Magnolia Street yielded overwhelming evidence. 7 shell casings scattered across the living room floor, the murder weapon recovered from Devon's hands, and the most damning piece of evidence, Devon's fingerprints, and only Devon's fingerprints, on the gun, the magazine, and the unfired bullets still in the clip. The boy's fingerprints, documented in detailed ridge pattern photographs that highlighted distinctive whorls and arches unique to Devon's small hands, told a story more precise than any witness statement could provide. Each finger had left clear impressions on the weapon's grip, trigger, and slide, indicating deliberate and firm handling of the gun, rather than tentative or accidental touch. Comparison prints taken from Devon during processing at the juvenile detention facility matched perfectly with those lifted from the weapon, creating what the lab director would later describe as textbook-perfect exemplars that left no room for doubt about who had handled the gun. In Devon's bedroom, investigators found evidence that would provide crucial context to the prosecution's case regarding his state of mind. A collection of violent video games, many rated for mature audiences, sat beside a notebook filled with drawings of guns and what appeared to be scenes of violence against uniformed figures. School reports discovered in a home office showed a pattern of behavioral issues, with teachers noting Devon's concerning fascination with weapons and difficulty controlling his emotions when frustrated. Most disturbing was a crudely written story found tucked under his mattress that described a scenario eerily similar to what had transpired. A young boy using a gun to save his father from police officers who were trying to take him away. This evidence, while not indicative of specific planning for the August 28th shooting, would later be presented by prosecutors as demonstrating that the idea of using violence against police had been gestating in Devon's mind for some time. The formal interrogation of Devon Booth took place with his court-appointed attorney and a child psychologist present, as required by juvenile procedure. Detective Davis entered the interview room at the juvenile detention facility where Devon had spent the past 2 nights. The detective would later describe his first impression in court testimony. He was small for his age, sitting there in detention clothes that were too big for him, swinging his legs because his feet didn't reach the floor. The recording of this interview, later played in court, showed Devon answering questions with unsettling directness, maintaining eye contact with the detective in a manner described by the observing psychologist as unusually composed for a child his age in such circumstances. When Davis carefully asked why he had taken his father's gun, Devon's response was immediate and would become a central element of the prosecution's case. "They were hurting my dad. I knew where the gun was. I knew it would make them stop." The question of how to charge an 11-year-old child with double homicide presented unprecedented legal challenges. Orleans Parish District Attorney Marcus Bennett convened an emergency meeting with his senior prosecutors upon receiving Detective Davis's preliminary report. "We're in uncharted waters legally and ethically," Bennett told his team, passing copies of the fingerprint evidence around the table. "But these prints tell us something unambiguous. This child, and only this child, handled the murder weapon." The decision to seek transfer to adult court sparked immediate controversy. Child advocacy groups argued that trying such a young offender as an adult violated the fundamental principles of juvenile justice, which emphasized rehabilitation over punishment. But prosecutor David Taylor, assigned to lead the case, argued that the severity of the crime and the evidence of premeditation warranted adult prosecution. "The defendant's age is a fact the jury may consider," Taylor would later tell the court, "but it does not change the legal standards for the crimes charged." The transfer hearing before juvenile court judge Eleanor Mitchell became a pivotal moment in the case, with national media descending on the New Orleans courthouse to witness these unprecedented legal proceedings. Taylor presented the court with the complete fingerprint analysis, enlarged to show the distinctive patterns on each of Devon's fingers, matching precisely with those found on the murder weapon. Forensic technician Sofia Rodriguez testified that the prints were textbook quality and explained how the distribution of prints on the gun indicated that Devon had handled it with purpose and familiarity, rather than hesitation or confusion. Defense attorney Jonathan Morris fought vigorously against the transfer, arguing that, regardless of the evidence of Devon's actions, his neurological development as an 11-year-old made it impossible for him to fully comprehend the consequences of those actions. Morris called child development expert Dr. Rebecca Lawson, who testified that the prefrontal cortex, which governs impulse control and long-term decision-making, is simply not fully developed in children of this age. After 3 days of hearings that captivated public attention far beyond New Orleans, Judge Mitchell delivered her ruling in a packed courtroom. The court finds that the evidence presented demonstrates clear and convincing reason to believe that the juvenile defendant, despite his young age, committed these acts with a degree of planning and intent that cannot be adequately addressed within the juvenile justice system, she stated, her voice steady but her expression grave. The exceptional nature of this case, the severity of the crimes committed, and the compelling forensic evidence presented leave the court with no appropriate alternative. With that ruling, Devon Booth became one of the youngest defendants in American history to be transferred to adult criminal court on murder charges, a decision that immediately sparked protests outside the courthouse and heated debates among legal scholars across the country. The trial of the state of Louisiana versus Devon Booth began on a cold February morning, the courtroom in Orleans Parish Criminal Court packed with spectators, media representatives, and the grieving families of the fallen officers. Devon, now 12 years old but still appearing much younger, sat at the defense table in clothes specially tailored to fit his small frame. The visual contrast between the childlike defendant and the gravity of the charges created a cognitive dissonance that unsettled everyone present. Prosecutor David Taylor's opening statement laid out a methodical case built on irrefutable physical evidence. "The fingerprints don't lie," he told the jury, displaying the enlarged forensic photographs. The defendant, and only the defendant, handled this weapon. He loaded it, he aimed it, he fired it. 7 times. And when it was over, 2 heroes who had dedicated their lives to protecting this community were dead. Defense attorney Morris countered with an emotional appeal focused on Devon's age and environment. "Look at him," Morris said, gesturing to Devon sitting at the defense table. "This is a child who grew up in a home where violence was normalized, where his father explicitly taught him that family must be defended at all costs, and where police were characterized as enemies rather than protectors." The prosecution's case moved methodically through the physical evidence, the forensic analysis, the body camera footage, the crime scene photographs. Each piece of testimony built an inescapable narrative of a child who had deliberately taken a weapon and used it to kill 2 police officers. The most devastating moment came when the jury heard Devon's own voice on the recorded interrogation. "They were hurting my dad. I knew where the gun was. I knew it would make them stop." Dr. Stephen Franklin, a forensic psychologist who had evaluated Devon, provided crucial testimony about his state of mind. "My assessment indicates that the defendant functions intellectually in the high average range," Dr. Franklin testified. "While his emotional development is age-appropriate, showing the limitations we would expect in an 11-year-old, his cognitive grasp of concrete consequences, particularly physical consequences like injury and death, is actually quite advanced for his chronological age." The defense presented their own expert, Dr. Rachel Winters, who argued that the 11-year-old brain is physiologically incapable of the kind of executive functioning required for true criminal intent, as defined in adult law. She displayed brain scans showing developmental differences between child and adult brains, emphasizing that the prefrontal cortex, responsible for impulse control and moral reasoning, is not fully developed in children of Devon's age. But perhaps the most powerful testimony came from an unexpected source. On the 4th day of the trial, Lisa Booth took the stand. Devon's mother, who had been subpoenaed by the prosecution despite her initial reluctance, appeared frail and exhausted as she was sworn in. Under Taylor's careful questioning, she described the environment in which Devon had been raised, the constant arguments, her husband's drinking, the normalizing of violence. "Robert always told Devon that a man protects his family no matter what," Lisa testified, her voice breaking. "He said the police were trying to tear families apart. He said if anyone ever tried to take him away, Devon would have to be strong." When asked directly if her husband had ever suggested Devon should use violence against police, Lisa hesitated, then quietly said, "Not in those exact words." But the message was clear. The jury deliberated for 8 hours. When they returned, the courtroom fell silent. The foreman stood and read the verdict. Guilty of 2 counts of second-degree murder. The jury had found that while Devon had intentionally killed the officers, the premeditation required for first-degree murder had not been proven given his age and cognitive development. The sentencing phase began 2 weeks later. Under Louisiana law, even second-degree murder carried a mandatory life sentence, but the question was whether Devon would be eligible for parole and, if so, when. Prosecutor Taylor argued for the maximum, life without parole, citing the exceptional nature of the crime and the need for justice for the fallen officers. Morris pleaded for mercy, arguing that sentencing a child to die in prison violated every principle of juvenile justice and basic human decency. He presented testimony from rehabilitation experts who argued that Devon, with proper intervention and treatment, could be rehabilitated and eventually released. Judge Richardson faced an impossible decision. On one hand, 2 police officers, fathers, sons, and community servants had been killed in the line of duty. On the other hand, the killer was a child whose brain was not fully developed and who had been raised in an environment that had warped his understanding of right and wrong. After a weekend of deliberation, Judge Richardson delivered his sentence. Devon Booth, you have been found guilty by a jury of your peers of 2 counts of second-degree murder, he began, his voice heavy with the weight of the moment. This court acknowledges that you are a child and that your actions were influenced by factors beyond your control. However, this court also acknowledges that 2 men are dead because of your deliberate actions. I sentence you to 2 consecutive life sentences, with eligibility for parole after 80 years served on each count, a total of 160 years before parole eligibility. The courtroom erupted. The sentence was effectively life without parole. Devon would be 171 years old before he could even be considered for release. Morris immediately announced plans to appeal, calling the sentence cruel and unusual punishment that violates the 8th Amendment. But Taylor stood by the prosecution's position. This sentence reflects the gravity of what was done. 2 families will never see their loved ones again. That is the ultimate life sentence. In the years that followed, Devon Booth's case became a landmark in juvenile justice, cited in law schools and debated by legal scholars. The sentence was upheld on appeal, with courts ruling that while harsh, it did not constitute cruel and unusual punishment given the severity of the crime. Devon was initially housed in a juvenile facility, but was transferred to adult prison when he turned 18. Reports from corrections officers describe him as quiet and compliant, participating in educational programs, and rarely causing trouble. Psychologists who continue to evaluate him note that as his brain has matured, he has begun to show signs of remorse, something that was notably absent during his trial. Michelle Smith and Breonna Taylor have both spoken publicly about the case, expressing complicated feelings about a sentence that effectively ensures Devon will die in prison. "Nothing can bring Joseph back," Michelle said in a 2025 interview, "but I also don't know if locking a child away forever is justice or just more tragedy." The families of Officers Smith and Williams established foundations in their memory. Joseph's focused on supporting children of fallen officers, Charles's on providing mentorship for at-risk youth. Both organizations worked to prevent the kind of violence that claimed their loved ones' lives. Devon's mother, Lisa, divorced Robert Booth and has become an advocate for domestic violence prevention, speaking about how the toxic environment she allowed to persist ultimately led to tragedy. She visits Devon in prison regularly, though their conversations are said to be strained and brief. Robert Booth served 3 years for domestic battery and weapons charges. He has never publicly commented on his son's actions, though sources say he blames the justice system for destroying his family. The house at 1423 Magnolia Street was sold and demolished. The lot remains empty, a small memorial plaque the only indication of what happened there on that August afternoon. Officer Smith's badge number was retired by the New Orleans Police Department. Officer Williams's academy class established a scholarship in his name for aspiring police officers. The basketball program he founded continues to operate, now serving hundreds of at-risk youth across the city. Every year on August 28th, a memorial service is held at the 1st District Station. Hundreds of officers attend, along with the families of Smith and Williams. Devon Booth's name is never spoken at these services. The focus is on honoring the fallen, not dwelling on the one who killed them. In a maximum security prison in Louisiana, Devon Booth, now in his 20s, sits in a cell he will occupy for the rest of his life. He has a GED. He reads books. He writes letters to his mother that she sometimes answers. He participates in whatever limited programs are available to him, but mostly, he waits. 160 years is a lifetime, multiple lifetimes. It is a sentence designed to ensure that Devon Booth will never walk free, will never have a family of his own, will never contribute to society beyond the prison walls. It is both punishment for what he did and prevention of what he might do again. Whether it is justice or something else entirely remains a question without a clear answer. 2 families lost their loved ones to senseless violence. A child lost his childhood to a terrible choice made with an underdeveloped brain. And a city lost its innocence, confronting the uncomfortable truth that monsters can wear the face of children. The only certainty is that on August 28, 2008, in New Orleans, Louisiana, an 11-year-old boy picked up a gun and changed countless lives forever. And for that, he will spend the rest of his life behind bars. A permanent reminder that some actions, regardless of age, carry consequences that cannot be undone.